Hello everyone, and hope you are enjoying Dash. Welcome to the Recruiting Through Retention, Scaling Your Engineering Org panel. My name is Jeremy. I'm the Director of Technical Community here at Datadog. Super happy to have Sajid, Nitika, and Maxime with us. I'm going to just read the abstract really quick to set context for everyone in case you didn't see the entire agenda, and then we're going to roll into brief intros from there. So as everyone knows, Dash is all about scale. And to scale your infrastructure and applications sustainably, you also need to scale your engineering organization. With competition for candidates at an all time high, that's easier said than done. From recruiting and hiring to training and onboarding, all the way through retention and engagement, there's a ton to discuss here. I do appreciate we only have about 45 or 50 minutes, so we're going to get things rolling quickly. And happy to have you join the discussion. So if you see that Q&A box there, just type stuff in there. And as we're talking back and forth, I'll be regularly checking that uh, and asking questions to our panelists. Super excited to have this group here together. Why don't we start out with you, Nithika, just a brief introduction.
Sure thing. Hi, everyone. My name is Nitika. I'm an engineering manager at the RealReal, which is a luxury secondhand consignment company. I currently work on one of our seller experience teams, helping us get supply in the door that we can ultimately sell to our customers. I'll pass it over to Maxime.
Hey, hello everyone. I'm a production engineering manager at Shopify. I've been at this company for more than 5 years. Production engineering, we build the underlying platform that powers and scales Shopify. I've been a manager for about 5 years now. Half of this time was at Shopify. I'm currently leading multiple streaming related teams, one working on commerce scale Kafka infrastructure on GCP and Kubernetes, and the other building change data capture system with DBZM, MySQL, and Apache Kafka. This retention panel is super interesting since I spend a significant amount of my time doing hiring week over week. I hope you enjoy the panel.
Awesome. Thank you, Maxime and Sajid. On to you.
Hi, everyone. My name is Sajid. I'm a Senior Director of Engineering here at Datadog. I've been here for about 3 years and have helped support a variety of teams in my time here, starting with our cloud services monitoring org, which included our serverless monitoring, and then also our network performance monitoring. These days, I lead our product platform group, which sort of owns a lot of our core platform features that get used throughout Datadog. So things like our dashboarding and notebooks products and some of our developer platform stuff as well. In my time sort of before Datadog, I've worked at sort of big tech companies as well as startups. And so excited to be here to chat recruiting as companies scale.
Awesome. One thing that is really exciting for me about this, aside from the challenges I'm having recruiting as well, is the wide swath of both experience and size of organizations here. All three of these organizations are scaling very quickly, but we have some at one end of the scale, low hundreds in engineering, and then at the upper end of the scale, many thousands in engineering. So it's going to be a really interesting conversation, I think. So I did post a quick poll for those of you that are interested in taking it, whether I'm just curious if others are facing this recruiting challenge as well. So far, there's not been a single no, but also curious to hear if maybe there's some organizations that think they have it figured out and we'll all learn together. So let's start at the beginning here with the question that Sajid brought up while we were discussing this topic, and that's how do you work with recruiting to source the correct candidates? So Sajid, since it was your question, we'll start out with you, but Nithika and Maxime, you'll be next, and curious what you all have to say.
For sure, yeah. Happy to kick us off. So sourcing is obviously sort of the start of the funnel. And I think, there's sort of a few things that I recommend. One is that I would take time to work with your recruiting team on that sourcing, right? And so that can mean a few different things. It can actually mean like sitting down next to them and actually spending some time getting to know the sourcing tools. That is something that I would highly recommend if you never had a chance to use whatever tools your company use, whether it's LinkedIn Recruiter or other things. Sitting down with a recruiter can really help you understand how that sourcing process works. Another thing that I think really helps is getting on the same page about what you're looking for in terms of experience, right? Particular technologies that will be useful, and then making sure that you're sort of getting continuous feedback to recruiting as time goes on, right? Helping recruiting adjust, like maybe a little bit more experience, or like, oh, we've had a bunch of candidates with like this sort of background. We'd love folks that maybe have more sort of startup or early product experience, or maybe folks that have experience with like scaling a product.
Great. So, yeah, Nithika, have you seen anything work here, and how are you working with your recruiting teams to source good candidates?
Yeah, one kind of really tactical thing we do at the RealReal that I really like is as we're filling out the job description and working with recruiting, we find 2 or 3 kind of platonic ideals of a candidate for the role. So if everything was magic, who would you love to hire for this role? And it gives them a really good template as they're sourcing to be like, how does this person compare to the ideal candidate my engineering manager set out? So I like that because it's just a really concrete way to say this is who I'm looking for. This is who I would love to have on my team.
Great. Maxime, any thoughts?
On my side, it's about keeping the feedback loop with the engineering manager, hiring manager, and the recruiter really short. So like keep the conversation open, share experience about interview notes, profile all the time, validate profile. Sometimes you want a more generic profile to get more applications. Sometimes you want more details to have the right people to apply. So you need to balance both all the time. Also, like about the funneling, don't drag any step of the process. Things happen fast, and if you do reach out, someone reply. Sometimes it's better to reply on the spot than say like I will do the best reply next week. And yeah, that's about it. Keep the conversation open with the recruiter, give feedback, learn the tool as they go, and that's it.
So
Another
kind
thing
of
I'd add
pulling on,
here.
oh, go ahead.
Oh, sorry. I was just going to say another thing I'd add here is referrals. Like I think a lot of companies see referrals as like a huge part of how they do sourcing, and usually some of the like the best hires that they get are recruited internally. And so one thing I've learned is being really deliberate about referrals. And so I've seen companies do a program where like once someone has had a chance to be at the company for maybe a couple of months, has like a strong sense that the company is a great place to work for, schedule a dedicated meeting with everybody and say like, hey, like we'd love to go through people that you think would be great to work at our company, and sort of figure out like who are they willing to reach out to, who are they willing for like recruiting to reach out to, and maybe use their name and say, hey, Sajid thought that you would be a great fit for Datadog or whatever the company is, or just folks that they've sort of identified, even if they're not necessarily putting their name out there or doing the reach out. That often is like a really strong source of candidates, really regardless of the stage you're at.
Yeah, definitely agree there. So, Maxime, you mentioned don't drag any step of the process out. Things happen fast, and they definitely do. Have you found any tips or ways to keep the process moving? I know sometimes the engineering teams are busy, the candidate's really busy. How do you keep things moving in those situations?
My main tips is do it now. Like if I add to reply to someone in my to-do list, it means it will take too much time. So like at the end of the day, I can keep 30 minutes just to do like all the thing I need to do by like reply to people, answer my reach out, and schedule my vetting calls. Uh, yeah, no, I don't have any magical trick apart than do it as soon as possible.
Nitika, Sajid, anything that you found is really effective for keeping things going?
Yeah, one thing that I do is, I have my set interview panel, but I make sure there's a bunch of kind of redundancies and backups so that if someone's calendar is packed that week, I don't have to wait a week to schedule the interview. I can just kind of slot someone else in. Because, yeah, in this kind of climate, a week is a long time and that candidate will get snatched up.
Yeah, for sure. So one thing that you mentioned when we were discussing this is during the interview process, you think it's really important to clearly communicate with each round what you'll be assessing, what the expectations will be, and nothing should ever be a surprise. That helps candidates prepare and show their skills to the best of their ability and keeps everyone comfortable. Now, at some organizations, for me, I've seen this done at a very rigid organizational level, and at some organizations I've been a part of, it's definitely like completely up to the hiring manager. There's some obvious trade-offs there. So curious what the group thinks about that.
Yeah, I mean, I've definitely, and I'm sure all of us have had those interviews where you go in and you're like, is this going to be a systems design interview? Is this going to be a behavioral? I don't know. I'm just joining and I'll see what they ask me. And I think that's not an optimal candidate experience. So I definitely like to be really clear about this is what I'm assessing. These are like the 4 calls you're going to have and what we'll be looking for. And at the RealReal, kind of the hiring manager does have discretion over that, which I think works at our scale. We're on the smaller end of the spectrum in this group, and I really like having that control and that kind of that ability to assess exactly the candidate I look for. I'd love to hear from kind of some of the bigger orgs if that's kind of how you run or how that scales at your size.
Cool. One thing that I found works really well, like especially as you scale, like I think you talked a little bit about sort of making sure it's clear like what the different interview types are. One thing that I found that helps a lot here is to actually have like a write-up that every candidate gets about what that process is and have that be sort of standard. Because earlier on, I've sometimes seen cases where different recruiters do different prep for candidates. And that can be something that introduces some amount of inconsistency. Maybe the process isn't quite as sort of fair as you'd want. And so when you sort of make changes to your interview process, make sure that there is like a document that all recruiting can use that sort of walks people through. And it also makes sure that you're sort of in alignment about how much you want to tell the candidate ahead of time. I've seen organizations where I think this is more true for management questions than for sort of technical questions, but I've seen organizations where they'll send the candidate ahead of time, like these are the questions we're going to ask you, so that they can have some time to prepare and sort of think about some experiences that are relevant. And there's some pros and cons to that, but I do think it's important to have that consistency and just sort of make sure that like everybody's kind of getting emailed the same document that runs through it.
Something I want to add on this is also like the hiring process is almost like selling something. So it's super important like to be transparent and give all the information, but sometimes like keeping it shorter is better for communication and can get confusing if you like throw too much information. Sometimes we try to do is just keep detail on the next step, but not every step of the way. Because for example, for the first step, the you reach out, you just want to sell people on the phone call itself, not the role, because you may never get there. So it's important to balance like multiple things.
Yeah, definitely agreed. One person asked if they should be asking questions now or they have to wait. No, jump in, ask questions whenever you'd like, and I'll put them in place where they kind of fit in, so it won't interrupt anything. Ask at your leisure. So, Nitika, one thing you said there is you're curious to hear from some of the larger engineering orgs. So, as your organization grows, I'm curious what you have found effective for scaling the interview process, because to me, that's been one of the biggest challenges. What works when you're small and growing very successfully might not work later. So, altering that process along the way is something that's super interesting for me. So, is there anything that you've seen here on how to scale the interview process? And is there kind of step changes or places that you think it makes sense to make those major process changes?
Yeah, I think kind of going back to having kind of redundancy on the interview panel, something we've been doing is just having more standardized interview training, as opposed to kind of this more ad hoc, oh, your team is hiring, let's get you trained up. Just, maybe after someone's been on the team for 3 months and you feel like they're going to be a good ambassador for the org, just automatically get them enrolled in some interview training. And that way, it's not a last minute scramble to get people on your panel. I think I've appreciated that because it's just kind of one less thing I have to think about. I can trust that my team is trained up so that when I am starting to hire, it's just kind of an automatic thing to get my team on the interview panel.
Sajid and Maxime, as part of larger but still growing very rapidly organizations, anything that you've seen along the way? Success and failure, to be clear. I think it's important to learn from both.
So for scaling, it's similar to software development. You want to automate every toil, every manual operation. So for example, if you still need to fill form like the name, first name in a software, then you lose time. So you want automation everywhere. You need more interviewer. We try to get almost everyone interviewing at Shopify, and we keep asking, like Nikita said, we ask people after an amount of time when they are eligible, then you should do the training. You should at least do the most popular interview. For consistency, yeah, it's training. Like you learn, you shadow, you interview. That includes diversity training, and also like for example for interview, some of them we try to put them in the GitHub repository. So we have a review process. So when people interview, they have a list of problem, a list of subject they can have, and everyone has access to the same path. And when it change, everyone see the change and why.
Cool. The one thing I would add there is is as you grow, I think you have to make sort of a very deliberate sort of set of trade-offs around sort of consistency versus team-specific hiring. Like it's possible to overdo it and say like there's going to be one process for the whole company. And especially as you grow, there are different roles within a company that demand different skills and maybe need to be approached differently. And so ultimately, like these questions about like how much do you want to say there's like a specific set of skills that we want every engineer at your company to have versus like sort of having a little bit more specialization, those are ultimately like really central cultural decisions that you have to make. And so my advice is just to make them deliberately and make sure that they are reflected in your interview process.
Yeah, agreed. There's an interesting discussion that got kicked off with Nithika's comment about sending the interview questions ahead of time. A few people were shocked, and it seems like a couple people are really for the transparency and think it's great. Some people seem to indicate that because a candidate might not make it all the way through the process and get cut off in the middle, that it could create some awkwardness. I'm always pro transparency, but I'm wondering if any of the group has run into that before, where someone knowing what the process looked like at the end and not making it actually cause frustration. Is that it's not something I've experienced, but no,
It's not something I've run into, and I think I guess I would say like not making it through is part of an interview process, and so it's definitely frustrating, but it is also kind of the reality of trying to get a job and being out there interviewing.
Yeah, and
sure.
I think I would just sort of echo what Nitika said. I think like ultimately you do want to make sure that even people who maybe aren't a fit still walk away with a good interview experience, because friends are going to ask people. But I do think there's a way to kind of have that sort of compassionate communication. Like a lot of management does involve sometimes having to communicate challenging things in a way that still shows that you sort of care about them, you care about their goals, and I think that's kind of what's needed here as well.
Yeah, agreed. So you had mentioned having multiple the same interviews and calibration and that consistency. How have you been scaling that while also accounting for, as the org grows, there are roles that genuinely are different. So how do you calibrate across those different roles?
Similar to what Sajid said, the more we grow, the more it's easier to have general pipeline for hiring. So we kind of shift the specialization part to onboarding and training. So we still have like really specific roles we hire for, but it's so much easier at some point to have a general pipeline, put all the effort there, and then we do triaging. So sometimes we meet a profile that like the people doing the triaging they are aware of, and then they will send it to the specific role. But still, like the sourcing, we try to group things together.
Sajid or Nithika, anything to add there?
I guess we're not quite at the scale yet where we have just a general hiring pipeline, but one thing we do is that if you have, 3 great candidates, you try to find a space for all of them. Like if I just have one head count, I see it as my responsibility to kind of advocate for the other good candidates to the other engineering managers. Because again, if you have a good candidate, you want to make it work, even if it's not on your specific team.
Yeah, I guess one small thing I would add there is just taking the specific example of, say, a system design interview. Like I think early on, people end up with sort of a natural sense that you might be looking for slightly different skills if it's like a really distributed systems heavy role versus where it's like a more product heavy role. And that's fine. Like maybe that's how you start, where like different interviewers have a sense of that. But then once you kind of do get a sense of what interviewers are looking for, it's good to codify that. It's good to say like, hey, if it's a distributed systems role, this is what we're looking for. If it's a product engineering role, like these are maybe the follow-up questions you should ask that are a little bit more focused on that skill set. And so I think sometimes these changes end up being a little bit emergent, and processes sort of are more about sort of formalizing what you've seen work rather than inventing something new.
So we do have a couple questions coming in about that transparency and giving feedback. One was, how much feedback do you share when you choose not to move forward? But also someone asked, as you're giving that feedback, not only how much do you give, but how do you look at it from a directional aspect, as far as how much do you give versus how much are you actually asking for in the other direction, which I think is important. Nithika, we'll start with you.
Yeah. So yeah, when I kind of choose not to move forward with a candidate, I always like to give, at least a sentence or two. And often just kind of like, these are some growth opportunities, or, this is actually what we were looking for. And I think you have slightly a different skill set. I think you obviously have to be careful, but I think that kind of, especially for earlier career developers, that kind of feedback can be really helpful as they kind of move forward in their career. So I take that pretty seriously. Actually, in terms of receiving feedback, that's actually not something I could totally be better at. And I'd love to hear kind of if you all have processes to get feedback on how you are as an interviewer and as a hiring manager.
Yeah, Maxime, any thoughts there?
For the feedback, I mean, on the training side and the shadowing part, we get to give and get a lot of feedback. But at some point when you do interview, it's get hard to get feedback because the only person you interact with is the interviewee. Um, so yeah, I mean it's in one-on-one with your peers, your manager. You can say like, oh, what do you think about this? You can talk about how you conduct interview, and even you get to train people to the interview, and they can challenge you like, oh, why are you doing this or not? So yeah, the feedback you need to get it in other ways because, for example, some candidates are will not be happy if you record interview. Um,
Sajid, what are your thoughts on feedback?
Yeah, no, I agree with both Nitika and Maxime said. I do think that in terms of getting feedback from candidates, like again, I've seen sort of a gamut from like large organizations sometimes will do surveys. Um, if you're smaller, I think even just having sort of the recruiting team ask for that feedback. I think it sort of depends a little bit about what you're looking for, but like one universal, I think, uh, idea around getting feedback is that it's easier to give feedback if you don't feel like it's personal. So if the recruiting team is asking for feedback on the technical interviews, you're a little bit more likely to get honest feedback, and sort of vice versa if the hiring manager is asking you about the recruiting process. And so I think that works as well. I think you also need to pay attention to sort of like the feedback that you get from candidates that ultimately, the different categories of candidates, from people who ultimately accept, who get an offer, who don't accept, and then folks who, for whatever reason, you decide aren't a fit for your organization.
Yep.
Also, if I may add, how we give feedback back to the candidates. So usually when we fill the review for the interview, we ask the interviewer to fill some interview to give to the candidate, and the recruiter that will do the reach out, the rejection, will try to digest this into something it's okay for the candidate to get, depending of the reason of the rejection. Like some people like we want a hands-on manager, and that person is like, I don't want to program. Then it's hard to get feedback, like, oh, you should grow this skill. But most of the time, we're like, oh, in a few years or a few months, we retry and work on this and that.
Yep. Another great question came in here, and something that I know I've seen organizations struggle with. How do you, as a group, deal with disagreements during debriefs? Is there anything that you do specifically to promote healthy discussion? But how do you handle those? Anyone have any pro tips there?
Sure, I can start.
Yeah, I
with
think
this
from
one.
my point of view, it's
Go ahead, Nitika.
it's just asking a lot of questions. I think really getting like, there's the first layer of feedback. We're really digging deep and understanding kind of why maybe someone is not interested in having someone on the team. So definitely asking questions, kind of trying to depersonalize it, really ask for data and not just kind of a general sense of, oh, I didn't vibe with this person. I don't think that's particularly helpful feedback. And then ultimately, I communicate this with my team beforehand. It is I am the hiring manager, so I do leave kind of ultimate discretion with myself. And I think just being clear and upfront about that with my hiring panel and setting that expectation also helps. I encourage healthy conversation. I want everyone's point of view, especially if you're going to be working with this person day to day. But ultimately, the decision and the responsibility is with me, and so I'm going to kind of make that final call.
Yes, Sajid?
Yeah, totally agree with everything Nitika said. I think one thing that I do always try to do is if there's someone who was maybe a no on a particular candidate, but ultimately you do decide to go forward, I always make sure to take some time to explain the decision. And sort of there's a difference between like sort of trying to go like I think it's just important to make sure you're saying like, hey, like this is the decision we've made and here's why. Sometimes that's the right thing. Sometimes it's like, hey, this is what I think is the right decision. And like, if you have any last concerns, I think you should just be mindful about which sort of conversation you're having, kind of letting them know the decision, or sort of saying like, hey, this is where I'm leaning, but if you feel really strongly, I'm happy to reconsider. I think it's helpful to kind of come into the conversation knowing which way you're going. I do think most organizations do sort of try to optimize to make sure that that when they do hire, that they're really confident, even if that means sometimes saying no to candidates that could otherwise be a good fit. And so that does tend to mean that maybe you are a little bit more willing to let someone to let one person's dissent be the reason you don't hire. But I do think it's important, as Nitika said, to make sure that it's based on a concrete sort of skill or particular kind of feature that you're looking for in someone to join your organization.
Yeah, Maxime, anything to add there?
Yeah, maybe a quick things I can add is most of the time it will be a consensus like do we hire this person or not, and sometimes it's like if it's a soft no, then in the end, like Nikita said, it's the hiring manager that will be accountable for that person when we send the offer. So most of that, what I tell people is like the reason you're still taking this person in should be a long-term reason. For example, if like, oh, I really need a manager tomorrow and this one is not good at this, usually we don't like this, but maybe like the start date will be in 6 months, and in 6 months you don't even it's not even a good reason anymore to hire this person. So like if it's a long-term reason, then that can be okay if you can sell it to other people on the hiring panel.
Yeah. A lot of great questions coming in, so we will continue to get to those. Really appreciate the engagement. And if you have any tips or other things that isn't strictly a question, also happy to discuss those as well. So switching gears just a little bit, to be mild, offers have gotten a little bit frothy recently. So with this in mind, how are you thinking about helping candidates make a decision to accept beyond just remuneration, which sometimes just realistically can't be matched? Nithika, why don't we start with you?
Yeah, I think one of the things that I am kind of lucky to have is that the RealReal has a mission of sustainability. Again, we work in secondhand clothing. And so I try to really kind of drive home that we are a mission-driven company, and that's something that often kind of inspires people. If you're given kind of a wide gamut of options, and comp is obviously one of those factors, I think having a mission that you can really get behind and that kind of inspires you to come into work every day is a really strong selling point.
Yeah, Maxime, you mentioned mission a couple times as we were discussing this topic. So do you have any additional thoughts to add there?
Yeah, like Nikita said, like being able to sell people on the company's mission is super valuable. Like at Shopify, it's make commerce better for everyone. So it's like, oh, everyone can start a business, feed his family, pay his rent. So that's great content. Beyond remuneration, like also there's the can give example of the great challenges they will solve in the team. You can list the interesting tech people will get to work with, and or the flexibility so people can bring new tech in the company or their interests, and even describing managing style like, oh, we give a lot of autonomy to teams. Yes, oh, it's micromanagement stuff. So it's a mix of all of these things, but there's limit on how big a gap you can fill beyond rem- remuneration.
Yeah, great. Sajid, anything to add there?
Yeah, I would just add, I think mission is definitely, I think, actually, what I would say just generally is that it's really important to make sure that you have a clear sense of for whom your company is the best place for them to work, right? The market's really competitive, and you need to have a good viewpoint of hey, if these are the things that are important to you, this organization is maybe one of the best places for you to work. And mission is definitely, I think, one of the top things that gets people excited. But different people are motivated by different things. For some, mission might be one of the factors, but maybe not the most important. As Maxime said, I think, oftentimes technology can be really a motivating factor, like autonomy, right? Usually, these really sort of frothy offers, to use your term, are coming from larger companies. So there are opportunities to talk about, increased autonomy, like broader ownership, or maybe that you just get to use industry standard technology, right? A lot of the really large organizations have more in-house stuff, and people want to develop kind of long-term skills. And so, whatever it is for your organization, and I also think that it helps to be able to talk pretty honestly about what are indicators that this is the right job for you versus what's not. And ultimately, some candidates will go to take the higher offer, and that's fine.
I think another thing that I've seen be really helpful is the ability to communicate how much impact an individual can have. Sometimes at a larger organization, it's difficult to feel like you're truly impactful, where the smaller the organization, obviously that changes that equation a little bit. Move to another question that came in, especially for smaller organizations. A lot of times they'll really only hire senior people. So as you're scaling, when do you think it is appropriate to hire mid-level and even junior people? Is there a place in that curve you've seen work really well, or a place maybe that you've not seen work well?
Yeah, I mean, I in general tend to be really bullish on more junior devs. I think one, they bring just like great energy, they ask really great questions that kind of more senior devs sometimes don't bring to the table. But there is kind of that threshold of you want to be able to support them, you want them to be able to be mentored and grow in their career. So it's really just identifying like when do your senior devs kind of start having that bandwidth to mentor and support and are not, just trying to keep all the requests afloat and kind of get their work done. So to me, just making sure that they have the support they're going to need to grow in their career. And I think someone mentioned this before, but it's a long-term investment. You might not be getting, a ton of value out of them in the first 2 or 3 months. So you just need to have that longer term view when you're hiring more early career devs.
I'll also
Someone
add,
asked on that.
Oh, I was just going to add to what Nitika said, that like it's used because I think I totally agree that it's useful to have a mix, and sometimes you'll end up in a place where you end up with like a distribution of work that needs to be done, where some of it maybe is like super interesting to a senior engineer, but then like let's say you need to sort of change the like SQL schema and do a bunch of migrations, right? To a senior engineer, that might feel like, hey, like I've done this 10 times. It's maybe not so interesting. But to someone a little bit more junior, it could be really exciting. They get to learn a ton about like doing good database design in the real world. And so I think it's also, in addition to mentoring bandwidth, like Nitika said, I think thinking about sort of what does the business need, and matching up, what is going to be exciting to people at sort of different stages in their career is another way to kind of think about what the right timing is.
Something also that can be done to kind of stabilize the risk of hiring more junior people is just have a more stable place where you get these people. So maybe your company will have its favorite university to get interns year over year. At Shopify, we even have like a partnership with university to have a computer science degree. And so people, they just do all their internship at Shopify. So this way for the training overhead, it's gets more stable. We kind of know what skill people miss, and we just keep training them. And at some point, it gets faster.
Yeah, I mean, I think onboarding is critical, but onboarding when you're talking junior engineers is even more critical, if that's possible. Which is a good time to segue. We've been talking a lot about hiring and recruiting, but if you don't have good retention and good engagement, then you need to hire even quicker, and the problem can compound really, really quickly. So it's pretty clear to me that the industry is seeing like record high numbers of churn. Do you think there's anything specific driving that, and are you also seeing it accelerating?
So yeah,
Sajid,
I can
we'll start
start
with you.
here. Yeah, sure. Happy to start here. So yeah, I mean, I think in the general question, like what's driving churn is an interesting question. You'll see like talking heads on CNBC trying to debate it from like a sort of global sense in some ways. I think the important thing is to like understand if it is something that you're seeing in your organization, why that's happening, right? And so obviously with COVID and the pandemic, there's more work from home, and so there's a few things that I think are common themes. Things like burnout, right? I think burnout is really can be multidimensional. Sometimes like people derive a lot of energy from the office, and when they lose that, the sort of they get burnt out, even if like the number of hours that they're working aren't changing. And so I think like ultimately, like I would say, I'm going to draw a little bit from a blog post from one of our engineering leaders here. Like I think one of the core jobs of management is to make sure you understand your the people on your teams, their motivations, and end up in a place where you're never going to be able to prevent everybody from churning. Like that's not your job, but it is your job to not be surprised by it, to make sure you understand their motivations, and if somebody is going to move on, that you sort of understand why and understand what's driving them to that decision.
So about the churn level, it's basically it boils down to software developer are in demand. Software is often the biggest strategic advantage a company can have. So burning out people, maybe it's the fastest way to ship the right product at the right time to get the market. But so if you want to have the retention, you need to give people a little bit of what they want, like opportunity to have a break, uh, better work-life balance. It's not always possible, so it's kind of a balance between what the company wants and what you should give people. But like Sajid said, you should be aware of like what people want in your team. Like that is that person about to burn out, like go take a vacation, or is that person super bored about the tech, maybe move team before changing company. So this is at some point you can have conversation with people to discover like what they want, what they need, and as a manager, you have many lever you can pull to help these people, and in
Yeah,
conversation you can discover which lever.
Nitika, have you seen anything different or additional things driving churn here?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's just kind of what we already mentioned. It is just the pandemic made a lot of folks reassess kind of what is important and what they actually want out of their career, especially because it is, we're all in our homes all the time now. And so work kind of takes up a much bigger chunk of that. So again, I think this is kind of where mission can really help someone kind of stay motivated. Like maybe, if the day-to-day work is kind of stagnated a little bit, or other things have changed, if they're inspired by the mission of the company, I think that's one of those things that's bigger picture that can keep them motivated. And so I definitely lean on that as something to kind of help folks stay engaged in at least some aspect of the job, if not all aspects of it all the time.
Yeah, so it's kind of staying on this thread quickly. Is there anything that you're seeing as a leading indicator of someone leaving? And is there anything, tips that you have for others to help identify those?
So one thing I'll say is that I think there can be a variety of leading indicators. One piece of advice I've given is to not underestimate the value of simply asking that question to one of your reports. Like it's not always appropriate, but it's one of these topics that I think. And so to be clear, I mean asking your report, like, are you exploring other opportunities? Are you thinking of leaving the company? Like I said, it's not appropriate in every situation, but I think if you have a sense that someone is less engaged, maybe is unhappy, I think it can be good to maybe have a more honest conversation with someone about sort of what their concerns are. Some people are more or less comfortable bringing concerns to the manager, right? Maybe someone just finds it really difficult to say, I have some concerns about compensation, or I have some concerns about something else. And by opening that door, I think you make it easier to have that conversation. I actually had an example where it was exactly that. The person felt like perhaps they weren't being paid as much as market. And actually, we were able to go into detail about sort of the equity. There was like aspects of their equity compensation that they didn't fully understand. And as they did, they actually were in a much better place. So that's one thing I'd suggest is sometimes you just need to ask directly.
Yeah, I love that. And I've never done that. I remember when you said that, that was like shocking advice to me. But I do think I often tell my team, I really want feedback, and especially kind of critical feedback, because I can't fix what I don't know is broken. And I think that kind of applies. Like, I think it's worth giving your manager an opportunity to fix the things that you're unhappy about before deciding to leave. It doesn't always work out, but then at least you've gotten the signal of like this thing is actually not going to change versus giving them the opportunity to change or address things that might be the reason you're thinking of leaving.
Another noticeable flag is when you give feedback to someone like, "Oh, I've seen your work going down lately," or "What's up?" and then there's nothing really that stands out, or after a few weeks or a few months, you see no change in behavior in the person, so you kind of feel at some point the person just gave up or something. So you can be proactive and offer new opportunities sometime, and sometimes that can do the tricks. And sometimes people they just took the decision to change company, and that's okay.
Yeah, I mean, previously you mentioned that managers have different levers to pull, and I was talking about this panel with Lauren, who's been on our people ops team for a long time, and she underscored that managers are really on the front lines of retention. So, has there been a lever or two that you feel are the most effective tools? If you have someone that you feel like it really is beneficial to the organization to retain, is there a lever or tool that you found is the most effective or one of the most effective to accomplish that?
As a manager, we have much more communication with other team, other manager in engineering. So like sometimes it's finding opportunity to do cross team projects. Someone people will feel more proud of, like, oh, I did this big project. It's even maybe promotion material. And also something we mentioned in our discussion before, it's internal mobility also. So just, I mean, letting people, someone know like, oh, you're good at this infrastructure work and you're tired of programming. Why don't you talk to this manager? They have an awesome infrastructure team.
Yeah, definitely +1 to internal transfers. I think that's a really powerful lever, and I think can often just a change of scenery can be really powerful for a developer who feels like they're, feeling a little stagnant in their job. Another thing that I've done, and this is obviously if my team has the bandwidth, but letting folks focus on kind of some developer happiness type of work. It's a little bit removed from really tight business deadlines. And it's kind of the work where you're making your day-to-day life better. So it can be kind of a different motivating factor. So maybe take a sprint or two to focus on, I don't know, really slow test suite or something, just something that'll make their job better, I think can be kind of also motivating and help folks re-engage with their job and the team.
Great. I do appreciate. Well, I was going to say we have about 5 minutes left, so just wanted to. There's quite a few questions, but yeah, if you have something to add, if you have any other questions though, if you're listening, please do put them in. We'll try to sneak them in last minute. The Sajid, your comment about transparency and just asking has really resonated with folks. People are commenting on that, so that's great to see. Did you have something to add? If not, we can get one.
Yeah, maybe I'll add something along those lines. Is that I think the way I framed it in that situation was asking it almost in a negative, but I think you can also use that as a positive tool. Like, especially like, I've had someone, who's been at the organization for a really long time. And so being able to ask the question like, hey, like what needs to be true for you to be excited about working here for the next 2 years, the next 3 years, right? Again, like I think acknowledging the fact that the person might not continue working there forever, and having an open conversation about like what they're thinking about in terms of their career, what they're looking for, is another way to sort of have that same conversation, sort of again open the door to a conversation that people sometimes think is taboo with their managers about what they need to be true to keep working there for a long time.
So we have about 5 minutes left. I'm going to try to sneak in at least two more questions here. So one complaint that I've heard over and over again at different sized organizations is that the company doesn't have a structured enough career ladder. And obviously in very small organizations, it's impossible. But as you grow, I think without that clear path and the understood and known expectations of what is the next level, even if you're not ready to get there yet, not knowing what the next level is, can be really frustrating. So what I'm curious what this group's experience has been, not just with quality career ladders, and if you have any tips on how to create them, that's great. But is there a right size for when they should be implemented, or is there a wrong size that you've seen not work out well? Maxime, we'll start with you.
Shopify grew a lot through the year, and a couple of years ago, it didn't matter that much what level you were at. Like everyone will just jump in a project, ship it, and have fun and celebrate shipping a new awesome feature. And then as time goes by, like people they stay at the company for I don't know 3 years, 5 years, and they're like, oh, I've been a senior for 3 years. What's up? Can I have a new title? So at some point, we felt the need to just draft a company ladder and we had scale expectation for each level. And even later, at some point, it felt like the technical leadership side of the track was not clear enough. So we even super clearly separated being a people lead or technical lead. So people can go all the way up the company and stay on the individual contributor track or the manager track. So they don't feel forced to become a manager to get a promotion at some point. This really helped with retention because people, they were like, oh, I don't need to have report. I don't need to approve vacation. But somehow we have less manager now because people they can just say, "Oh, I'm tired of dealing with this political stuff. Let's go on the IC track again."
Yeah, I think that separation between a management track and an IC track is so important. Because I think, again, to Maxime's point, if folks are just wanting to go into management to get that next promotion, I think that's probably one of the worst reasons to become a manager. I think it's just not going to be the job for you if that's the reason. So I'd say, yeah, anytime you introduce a career ladder, making sure there are two very separate and concrete paths So that, and really digging into why someone would want to go down each of those paths is really important as you're coaching and growing your folks.
Yeah, becoming a manager is not a promotion, it's a career change and should be treated as such. Yeah, Sajid, anything to add there?
Cool. The last thing I'd add just there is that when you think about making changes, it's really important to think about the rollout of those changes. Like, I think you can either have a change that's designed to reflect what you think is already happening in the organization, but if you are going to make a change that like will actually change people's roles, you need to make sure you spend as much time thinking about the rollout as you do the actual changes.
Also, I
Yeah,
can add on this ladder. There's in each step, each level, there's a big overlap between the people manager and the technical leader. Like manager will still join technical decision meetings and such. So it's even if the expectation is set and you can grow your career, it's not should not be used as a tool to say like, oh, it's not my responsibility, it's your. And
Yeah, I mean, there's so many really good questions in here still, and we are actually more than out of time. We're going into the negative now. One thing there's another one in here that I was going to discuss. So if we want to just maybe just 20 seconds each, and then we'll wrap it up, is one thing that I've seen be a really big challenge as organizations grow is how do you switch from team specific onboarding to company wide onboarding, and their importance, I think, changes as you grow, and it almost oscillates back and forth oddly. So is there anything that you've seen be successful in how do you get that team specific onboarding and company wide onboarding correct within your engineering orgs? Maxime, we'll go Maxime, Sajid, Nitika, and then we'll do last thoughts and we'll wrap up so the next session can get started here.
so there is definitely always a common ground between engineering like area and the organization, like how we ship or we use GitHub or however we ship code. But at some point, like the onboarding content almost feel useless for like more specific team. So this team or their more nearest organization, they need to also like produce content for onboarding, and people they need to ask and update this content over and over again, and it's still need to integrate to just follow the company general content. And also I want to throw also the company mission there at, so for example at Shopify we have we have a merchant facing product, so we have people to kind of try to do support so they can build empathy. So that's also an interesting side of it, because if people don't care about a part of the onboarding, then maybe they won't build empathy for the team supporting that part. So that's also an important part.
Cool. I'll just quickly add, sort of repeat something I said before, that this is also like a really intentional culture decision that you should think about. Like Facebook, I think famously has like a boot camp that everybody goes through. And they also have quite a lot of internal mobility, and that's a pretty core part of their culture. Other organizations are different. And so I think, again, I would just say like, be really intentional about how much you want to try to create sort of like a cohesive company culture versus having more team specific things, and make sure that's like reflected in how you actually do your onboarding.
Yeah, I guess the last thing I'll add is that I think in this kind of remote world, the like company-wide onboarding has just become that much more important, especially if you're only going to be every day talking to like the 4 or 5 people on your team. Having that really strong company onboarding at the beginning makes you feel like you actually joined a new company and not just a group of 5 people. So really leaning on that to get people excited about the company when they're not seeing everyone at the company or going into a branded office. I think it's just become so much more important.
Yeah, agreed. This is a topic I know I could talk about for another couple of hours. Unfortunately, as I mentioned, we are out of time. So Nitika, Sajid, Maxime, thank you very much for joining us. Hope everyone watching this learned something and has an actionable tip that they can take place. If you're not being transparent in your recruiting process, please be more transparent. I think it's an area that as an industry, we could definitely improve. So if that's the one takeaway from this that happens, that would be amazing from my perspective. So enjoy the rest of Dash, and thanks.